Good morning and welcome to the CSPS Virtual Cafe, where we bring contemporary ideas to public servants to help them better think about and better execute the tasks of all the things that public servants have to do. Today, we are talking about a very interesting subject, polling. And we often think of polling in terms of elections. And that's kind of the, let's call it the sexy part of polling. But polling is actually a huge part of government's decision-making process, including obviously the Government of Canada's decision-making process. Polling is basically in some ways a fancy way of saying, how do we know the sentiment of people? How do we measure or indicate or profess what we think they want or what they know or any other type of question. Today, we are joined by three wonderful experts in this field. The first is Professor Claire Durand from the University of Montreal, and she is a professor there in the Department of Sociology, but more important for our purposes, she is one of Canada's, if not the world's, top experts on polling methodology, and she is also a past president of the World Association of Public Research. So welcome, Professor Durand. The other two that are here are actually long-standing friends of the Canada School and also of Canada's Public Service. The first is Mr. Nick Nanos, who's kind of chief brainiac of Nanos Research Group, I think it's called. And the third and final is Anil Arora, who's the chief brainiac and also known as the chief statistician at Stats Canada. So we're going to spend the next hour talking about ideas. And so grab a coffee and join us. So we're going to start with a very big question. And that big first question is as follows. In the aftermath of the US elections in both 2016 and 2020, we had a lot of people talk about how we're not quite sure who the winner is, but we know who the loser is, and the loser is polling, that the polling industry took one on the chin in 2016 and 2020. And that'll be a good way for us to start talking about some of the issues that are intrinsic to polling. So who wants to start us off? Maybe I'll ask Nick and then Claire and then Anil. Nick.
Thanks, Tyke. I'm just looking at my watch because it took about 30 seconds for you to throw me under the bus as the pollster on the call, but thank you. I do feel welcome, and I do look forward to crawling out from under the bus. The narrative that the polls failed in the 2020 election is basically a false narrative from my perspective. You know, the fact of the matter is on election night, most of the ballots were still not counted because of the mail ballots. We empirically now that more of the ballots are counted, we know that 48 of 50 states were predicted correctly. The popular support for Biden was basically bang on at around 51%. Trump was underestimated at about 4%. And, you know, when you look at the last 50 years of polling, I think the average error is about 4 to 5%. So this was basically a standard election. You know, the only difference was, and maybe this is one of the things we learned, is that not all the ballots were counted. And there was a significant difference based on the mode of voting, that if you happen to be voting in person, you're more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And if you are more likely to vote by mail, you're more likely to vote for Biden. And that difference accounted for the initial narrative, but that's a bit of a false narrative, so to speak. So I'd like to declare that I am not under the bus, at least anymore. And I'd like to say we didn't do any polling in the election.
You've possibly escaped the treadmill bus. Claire, what are your thoughts on 2016 and 2020?
First, we should not base our judgment about polls on what's happening in the US, because what's happening in the US is not what's happening in UK, Canada, etc. Second, in 2016, 8 of the 13 polls that were published during the last week were within the margin of error when all the ballots had been counted. 2020, I'm surprised that Nick did not mention that, but the telephone polls, whether with live interviewers or IVR polls, perform very well. Most of them are within the margin of error, no problem, and the IVR poll are almost on target. The polls who did not perform well mostly are web polls. But now, this was not the case in Canada. In Canada in 2019, the three modes had about the same forecast at the end. This is not the case in the US, but think about it. They have 53 different pollsters who conducted polls from September 1st. 20 of them conducted only one poll. So contrary to Canada, where we have a group of 10, 12 pollsters at most who conduct electoral polls and know how to do it and know what to look for and what to check, you have 53 pollsters. You see the aggregators, they aggregate everything together as if there is no difference in modes, no difference between pollsters. And we think that we have that many different estimation of the vote, but in fact, many of these people use the same providers for their sample. So, you know, if there is a problem with a provider, it's shared by a number of pollsters. So the situation in the US is different. There is a difference in mode of administration, so that if you look, you know, I have a colleague in Uruguay who says it's probabilidad or muerte. Say it's probability or death. So the polls that use the probability or mostly probability samples did fare better in that election than the web polls who use. And then you have to speak about web polls. They use lots of different types of sources for their sampling.
Yeah, so Claire raised three interesting points that we'll come back to throughout the discussion, or at least three interesting points. One is time, one is the US versus others, and the other is the method of getting the kind of the sentiment of the population. Anil, you're not a pollster, but you play with numbers a lot as a chief statistician. In 2016 and 2020, did that change in any way, good or bad, what you thought about kind of polling as an indicator of the body politique?
Well, firstly, I think you got it right. Statistics Canada does not do polling per se. I mean, we do from time to time some sentiment indicator work, but you know, polling is something that we don't usually get into. I mean, we're more into the how many, you know, the what and so on. You know, first of all, I just want to kind of, you know, make 3 points. First, it's a very complex task, and you know, Claire and Nick have just talked a little bit about, you know, some of the things at play. The first is, you know, in polling, you're trying to measure both the intention, that's what people are usually measuring, and then you get judged by the actual vote, you know. So if you were just trying to track the intention over time, I think you'd see, you know, even greater kind of results. So, you know, people would say one thing, but they may not necessarily act in that same way. Then the second thing, I think, you know, Claire's absolutely right. You know, when you start to look at different modes, well, people actually have different habits and behave differently. They do, those modes, in fact, do target certain types of populations. And so the statistical rigor by which you integrate these things really does matter. And sometimes the sophistication may not be there. And that's why you see, you know, differences as Claire's talked about. And really you know, the third point is, what a great opportunity, I think, to inform Canadians and educate Canadians and you know, give them this really good sense of when you see a poll or when you see a survey, you know, what are the kinds of questions that you should be asking yourself when you start to look at those results and actually base decisions on them. So I think it's a real opportunity to, you know, emphasize methodology, you know, quality, timeliness, you know, and transparency, because at the end of the day, I believe we're all in the same business, right? We're there to inform Canadians to make good choices based on what's going on. And that means equally we have an opportunity in that ecosystem to make sure that people aren't walking away with something when the facts are actually saying something very different.
Yeah, so that's going to be a big part of our discussion, which is what's a good poll? What makes a good poll? Because we have a plethora now of polls that are hitting us from everywhere, whether it's in the print media, whether it's in the electronic media, whether it's in social media. We are saturated with polls. So I want to start, I kind of talked to you guys a little bit about this at the beginning. I want to go back to when I had a little bit of hair and the hair wasn't gray. I would kind of watch TV at night before I went to sleep, and there was a gentleman named Knowlton Nash, and he would kind of pronounce on the day's events, and he would kind of tell me and other Canadians kind of what happened today and what mattered today and why it mattered today. And one of the kind of the marquee phrases that would come across his screen to mine would be a new Gallup poll today was released indicating that Canadians ... that, you know, we wanted more health care, or we wanted less health care, or we wanted childcare, or we didn't want childcare, or that we were confident about the future, or that we were not confident about the future. Nick, was life, first of all, was it easier back then when, you know, it was Mr. Gallup or his organization that would kind of tell us what we thought? Was it accurate? Was it more accurate? Was it less accurate? At least we know one thing for sure. There were fewer of you in the past.
Yeah. Some quick comments. First of all, you know, empirically, the first 30 years of the polling industry were not the good old days. There were some big misses, historic misses, like the Dewey election, because it was a new industry, people were still learning about methodology. But, you know, what we did see was a period where the methodologies were consistent, where it was possible to reach the whole universe when everyone had a landline, when people participated willfully participated in surveys, and there was direct comparability. To Claire's point earlier about the U.S. election, there was direct comparability, and there were also obstacles to entry. Like, you know, it was hard to get into the polling business. You needed to have your own infrastructure. You needed to have your own call center. And those barriers actually increased the quality. It increased the price, but it increased the quality. So there was a period when most of the pollsters were doing it the same way, that we had fairly consistent results and good results, and you could have a probability sample, and we could reach everyone. Fast forward now, and, you know, to Claire's point, there's a diversity of methodologies. They're not transparent. Coverage isn't there, right, in terms of the whole population, and that's why pollsters are calling cell numbers and you know, looking at other alternatives. And as a result, you know, we can't mix all these polls together when you're an aggregator, and you know, anyone, you know, it's terrible for me to say, but, you know, if you have the money to buy a sample, you could be a pollster, right? And you know, I think that's so, you know, there was a period where there was much more certainty and greater quality and greater results, but now we're in a transition phase. The good news is that, you know, there's still a lot of pollsters that do very good work. There's a lot of researchers that do excellent work, but we have to now start looking at the fine print. Was it a random sample? How is the survey administered? All those other things, and we have to pay a lot more attention to those things in the past when everybody was using basically the same methodologies.
Claire?
Yes, lots to say. I've been a pollster then, and we would promise that the response rate would be 60%. So those were the good old days. Nobody promised that anymore. The current situation, the specificity of the current situation is that in previous transition, like when there was a transition between face-to-face to telephone polls, it arrived all at once. Like in one election, everybody was face-to-face. Next election, everybody was telephone. This one, we see it as a transition, but we have three modes that stay, and then we say three modes. But what I've seen in the U.S. is you had about 17% of the polls who were mixed modes. Of course, the IVR polls there have to be mixed mode because they can't call cell phones, so they have to complete their sample. But I've seen web plus telephone, telephone plus IVR, etc. So we have number of methods. This is very good because we can estimate, analyze the difference between modes, why they are there, and perhaps improve. Okay. In the good old days, as you say, I remember that we did a random sample and then we look at the demographics, and it was StatCan. You know, we didn't have to wait that much. It was about StatCan. So we're not there anymore. So we have to look at other things. Okay, I've looked at a number of data files. This is very interesting. For web polls, for example, I see that if you take it globally, like Quebec or Canada, you will probably have a rather good estimate and a good composition of the electorate. But when you go subnational, when you go regional, then, you know, if you have Anglophones in Quebec and 50% of them live outside Montreal, there is a problem. You have things like that. You have the good number of Anglophones, but they're not at the place that they should be. So there needs to be improvement in the samples for web polls.
Okay, so let's get into this a little bit, because we've been dancing around a little bit the notion of what is a good poll. And Nick talked about you have to look at the footnotes, and most Canadians, you know, we have lives and we can't look at the footnotes. So let's talk a little bit about three of the footnotes. I want to talk about one. I want to talk about random sample. Number two, I want to talk about sample size. And number three, I want to talk about mode of asking the question, because you've both kind of hinted that, you know, telephones are this and cell phones are that and in-person is that and web is a third thing. So let's start off with random sample. Nick, why is it important to have a random sample?
Well, I'd always kind of say if someone wants to do a survey, they're not normal. If they volunteer, you want people to be randomly, except for the StatsCan survey. If they do a StatsCan survey, they are patriots, I'd like to say. Okay, so, you know, I have a preference for random probability surveys. And you know, the thing is that what we want is people to be randomly selected so we can try to have a representative group. That said, what we find is that we have to have much shorter surveys because people's ability to share time is limited, especially now that we're calling people cell lines. We can't be doing a 15, 20-minute survey where someone might be chewing up part of their cell phone plan. So that's the way we've been kind of adjusting in order to accommodate people. But yeah, so the randomness from my perspective is critical. But you know, the fact of the matter is that you don't always need a random sample for every single research project. So we should not be holding up random samples as the panacea for everything. There are situations where you don't necessarily need a probability sample because it's a defined population and it might be from a list of certain types of individuals. You still want to probably have randomness within that, but not kind of like the pure random sample that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So Anil, in government, kind of random is a bit of a bad word, isn't it? That kind of like, you know, we don't do things in random ways. We do things in targeted ways, and we do things with some sophistication. And like, you don't go around and randomly ask people questions, right?
We absolutely do. Random random is really a math issue. What you want to do where notwithstanding, if you're going to go for a targeted aspect, is you want to be able to calculate the probability of somebody being selected. And then based on that, you want to make sure that everybody has an equal chance, so that when you weight up, the responses to the total population, you haven't skewed, anything. Now, there are stratified random samples as well. So you can, you would say, okay, if you're, if you're going to sample an apartment building, which has 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom apartments, you're not going to just do a random sample, because the characteristics of those in the 3 bedrooms is not going to be the same as the first, or even the amount of rent that people pay, in an apartment, depending upon which floor they're on, is going to be different, right? So yeah, sometimes you have to stratify, but then within there, you want to make sure that you can calculate the probability of somebody being selected. So, all our surveys have elements, and as I said, it's a mathematical issue for us to be able to calculate. So the footnote that you don't read, is really important to read, because of the math that goes into how that individual is selected. Now, not from Statistics Canada's perspective, but of course, having worked in a couple of policy departments earlier, to your point, the government does absolutely, ministers, the cabinet, all of us, when we start to put options and what recommendations there may be, we do take into account studies and polls and so on. And so, to folks that are listening today, yes, you might be busy, I get it, but please take the time to differentiate before you give every single source and every single data point the same weight, because they're not the same weight. So if you're, looking at one option and one recommendation from one source with a different set of, quality indicators, and you're trying to say, well, they're all the same, well, they're not. So I would say it is important for all of us as policy analysts and trying to provide the best advice as policymakers to actually get informed and understand the methodologies and understand the limitations. If something excludes, a certain population, like our Indigenous population or youth or those below 18, it's kind of important for you to know that if the recommendation that you're making, assumes the opposite. So, get informed and get involved. And, whether you're taking, information from a poll, whether you're taking information from Statistics Canada, ask those questions and pay attention to those footnotes.
And that's a really important point, because what Anil is saying is we have to, as policy people, as program people, as people who kind of advise, and as people who put options before people that decide, we have to be critical consumers of information, including polling information. We can't just take something that's presented to us as the automatic truth, because part of our job is to do quality control before it goes forward. Claire, tell me a little bit about random sample. How can it be random if I'm on a website and I kind of self-select to fill out a poll, or if I'm on some web page and then all of a sudden it says, take this poll, like, just isn't the fact that I'm on this web page, doesn't that mean something about me? Doesn't that mean that the sample, almost by definition, isn't random?
Look, there are lots of ways to have non-random and quasi-random polls out there. The first thing I'd like to say is that I think researchers like me went from these web polls are not random, and so they should not be giving the accurate information. We went from that to why do they give a good information most of the time? So now we have to try to understand that. Now you say you're on a website and it pops up and you have, this is a new way new way. Like it's been perhaps 10 years. The first web posters tried to have an opt-in panel, and this is fixed, and they try to have more people on it. But at a certain point, they stop recruiting because they have to get in touch with these people and all that, and this is a lot of work and money. So they try this reverse sampling. So they put surveys on a number of websites, and it pops up. So they try to vary these websites so that it, in the end, will represent all the population. But then you have another method also, where if you are a client of Costco, for example, you will receive a message from Costco, and then at the end it will say, would you, take this survey? So those are all ways web posters use to try to randomize. And because they know that their opt-in panel are a bit biased, they're biased towards people who are have time, people who do not work, people who are interested in politics, and we would think young people, but in fact old people. They have much difficulty finding young people. So you have all this that is, and some web posters go get 3 different sources of sample plus a telephone sample and put all this together. And they, in a way, they try to balance the inconvenience and advantage of everything. So this is what's happening right now. So perhaps I have to raise 2 points because Nick spoke about short surveys, and what I see out there, people have surveys of 1 hour. This is not respecting the respondent. It's not possible. You have to ask yourself, what can I ask somebody? And should not be much more than 20 minutes, 30 minutes for StatCan, I'd say. But some of these surveys are way too long. Finally, I do not understand. I have to raise this question absolutely. Why does StatCan and other agencies put surveys on the web, on websites, and tell people that they should go on the website and answer this? This is not a web survey. This is the worst of convenience sample. So they did that during the pandemic at one point, like, go on this website. I received the link. Go on this website and answer our survey. Okay, I don't know why me, and I saw it on Twitter. This should not be considered web surveys. Like surveys that are conducted on Facebook, this is not a web survey. Okay, it's something like, I'd like to know your opinion.
Right. So Anil, do you wanna say something, or do you want us to go back to the?
No, I'm happy to respond. First of all, context matters, right? We first did our crowdsourcing survey, back before cannabis was legalized, and clearly there are going to be times when you don't just knock on the door or phone somebody up and say, so how much illegal cannabis did you purchase today, and what was the quality, and who'd you buy it from, and what was the price, and so on. So in the absence of nothing, sometimes you have to be able to get a qualitative indication of what's going on. And but you know, but you don't leave it at that. You don't. But if you present it as you know, a robust, qualitative, you know, result, then you know that's duping the user. But sometimes, you know, the gap and allowing you know, anybody, you know, have a debate on whatever it is they think is happening is not the best thing. Two, numbers do matter. You know, our first crowdsourcing during the COVID, we got you know, nearly 250,000 Canadians who participated in this. And we were able to triangulate the characteristics of those individuals to the population and be able to give, you know, some indication of quality, but we were very upfront about, look, this is not a, you know, a regular survey with the kind of, you know, quality that we would. So I think transparency is really, really important. And when we're saying we're getting an idea of what's going on here, I think that's important. The third thing is that we were able to go back and have a look at some of those with some of our other surveys, which were based on the robust methodologies, and be able to look at, you know, consistency or inconsistency of responses. And the last thing is that many of the people that participated in our crowdsourcing then further to that participated and signed up to be on our web panel. So it was also a way to move forward. Now we are doing some really interesting statistical work to go back and see if we can retrofit some of those people that voluntarily took part in some of the crowdsourcing, and be able to then see if there is a weight that can be assigned to them based on, you know, the responses that they gave us. It's research work, and we have no idea where it's going to turn out yet, to see if there is some reverse engineering that can get us some ideas of quality. So sometimes, you know, if for us, you know, to take a pressing issue and say, well, we'll be back to you in 6 months, doesn't really work. So sometimes you do have to get, as long as you are upfront with the users and quality. We're not pretending it's a survey. We're not pretending that it has the same quality of some of our robust surveys. And it's by far the exception that when you do that, not the rule. So I agree with Claire. You know, we shouldn't be doing this all the time, but there is a time and a place. And as long as we're transparent about it, I think that helps.
Yeah, and there's another thing that we should add as researchers is that one of the key principles of quality research is repeatability. That someone else can take your methodology and repeat it, or if you use the same results. I know that our firm has had problems crowdsourcing in terms of the repeatability. The repeatability was only 12 times out of 20, as opposed to 19 times out of 20, and which is why we've kind of opted for random recruiting people through Land and Cell Line to deploy to an online survey as our approach, at least. But you know, in terms of what StatsCan is doing, the proof in the pudding will be their ability to repeat the study and to repeat the findings and to triangulate that. And I would say, Anil, it's probably a work in progress, right? Kind of because it's not your only data point, but you're kind of let's try to do some experiments. Now, as long as we don't hurt the ecosystem doing those experiments, we're good with that. But I think repeatability is one of the things that we need to focus on.
Terrific. So
if I could just add, Taiki, I mean, we do about 400, you know, programs, surveys, etc. We're talking about, you know, 4 or 5. So by no means is Statistics Canada getting into this, you know, business in a steady state. The second thing is, to Nick's point, there's some really neat research papers internationally now that are being coming, you know, are being prepared, where statistical agencies that are trying some of these things to see if the methodologies can in fact learn from some of those experiences. So, you know, it is at best experimental, and I think this is what we do all the time to push the science. And you got to try some things, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work.
Exactly. So back to what makes a good poll. So we talked a little bit about sample size. We talked a little bit about random. So take away the young policy analysts out there that if it's not random, it's almost garbage, or sometimes it's worse than garbage. And they'll put in a couple of qualifiers in terms of stratified randomness and, you know, targeting particular populations. And then the other thing is respect people's time, because if you're out there, if you want to find out what a grain farmer wants to know about WTO subsidies, probably not a good idea to ask him or her to give you 3 hours of their time. So figure out kind of what you really want to know and ask that. And second, don't bother them during harvest. Like, they're not going to really, so kind of respect their time is a good rubric for that. Let's go to sample size now. This is one that's always kind of intrigued me, that with, what's our population in Anil? 37, 38 million?
Just over 38.
38 million. So how many people do we need to get a good sample size or an accurate sample size of what Canadians think on any given subject?
It depends. Do you want to know what people in the Maritimes, the Atlantic provinces think, and people in Quebec think, and people in Ontario think, and people in BC think? Do you want to have this kind of detail? Because different regions of the country will not necessarily see things in the same way. And the more detail you want to have, every time you will say, okay, I need 1,000 in Quebec, 1,000 in Ontario, 1,000 in BC.
Okay.
So you end up with a lot of people. As a matter of fact, I was extremely surprised to see in the US polls at the national level of 700 or 800 people, where you say, okay, this is not possible. You should. And not random. You should really have the more diverse a population,
right?
The larger the sample size should be.
But is there a rule of thumb that says, if you really want to know what 38 million Canadians think about a given subject, if you're asking less than, I don't know, 1,000 of them or less than 10,000 of them, it's worthless. Nick, Anil?
No, I think if you're doing a random sample, the results are the same, whether it's 500, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 in terms of the top number, right? But to Claire's point, the power to do analysis is diminished with the smaller sample size. That you will not be able to kind of look at subpopulations to kind of, and usually whenever we're discussing the size of the sample, I focus more on, well, what type of analysis do you want to do? To Claire's point, if we want to know what, francophones in New Brunswick think, well, that means something else in terms of the size of the sample. So we should not be thinking, and also if you look at Canadian elections, there's no correlation between the accuracy of the survey and the number of interviews. Zero.
So you're saying something that's counterintuitive to me as a layperson. So what you're saying, if I understand you right, is that with kind of as little as 500 randomly selected people, I can tell you what 38 million Canadians think on a given subject.
Well,
but your margin of error will be larger.
Yeah.
Right.
But that number hypothetically would be the same.
Okay. And then my margin of error becomes like statistically respectable at 38 million if I ask how many people? 1,000, 2,000, 20,000?
Look, the population does not enter into the equation. The only thing that enters into the equation of the margin of error is the size of the sample and the proportion. Okay, so if you've got something like years, 1995 in Quebec for the referendum, and it was very close, some people had 10,000 as a sample. Okay, because it's very close, and then the margin of error, if it's too large, you can just say that it's close, and that's it. If you have a situation where it's 60-40, then your margin, your sample can be smaller. But the 38 million or 3 million or 380 million, it does not enter into the calculation.
That's fascinating.
Taking that, I think Claire put it perfectly when she said, it depends. And I think that's really the answer. So if somebody only has $10 to find out something, you go pick randomly somebody on the street and you ask them the question and you say, well, that's pretty well what Canadians think. How right are you going to be? How repeatable is that going to be? How does it represent every single person in this country? Probably not that well, right?
Yeah.
It depends on what you're going to use the information for, how much time you have, what kind of error you can stomach. Who are the populations you're going to exclude? What kind of sophistication you have in terms of the ability to use those results. So there are a number of factors that go into this. And let me give you two. Now, we don't do polls, right? I don't think we could ever do a survey, with 800 or 1,000 responses. We just couldn't do it because I wouldn't be able to give it to a policymaker to say, do something with this. Just couldn't do it. So the labor force survey that we do every single
Anil, can I pause you just to educate
for
a sec? No, I want you to go back to it, but just to educate us as a parenthesis, what's the difference between a poll and a survey?
Right. So a poll is usually you're trying to get a sentiment. What does somebody think about something? Okay. And a survey is the facts. What is the underlying, so for example, we're not asking people for what do you think the unemployment rate is. We're trying to calculate it. We're not asking you what is the price differential between a commodity from one month to the next. We're trying to control for, size, volume, quality, et cetera, and giving you the standard, giving you the kind of comparable change. So and usually, what we're doing is setting the baseline, whether it's population demographics, breakdown, age groups, et cetera, so that when Nick does a poll, okay, that he can go and say, okay, I picked randomly, here's the math, okay, 1,000 people, okay, and I got from them what they think about something. And now he can say, well, I had so many seniors, so many people in this age group, so many in this geography or whatever, and then says, okay, what does that can say is a baseline? And then says, oh, okay, well, that one response, okay, has a weight of 10,000, okay, or whatever it is. And then you can now calculate, if you were to pick that sample multiple times, what would be the variance in the responses that you would get in each of those samples. And that's what, that's usually what what the quality statement is. And so when you're talking about a sample size, as I said, the labor force survey, for example, we do 56,000 households or 110,000 Canadians who give us responses on their labor force situation. And yet it still struggles to get us high quality, stable rates in very small areas. So you're talking about the census that we do, right? Which is every single household has a, 1 in 5 sample for the long form, and yet we know that in certain areas, we still have to suppress responses because, we're not going to get the kind. So it depends on the phenomena or the population that you are most interested in knowing. And of course, the most, like for example, if we're talking about an LGBTQ plus population, by its very nature, it is so small. Okay, so if you pick the average person on the street, or you pick 1,000 people, and you are now trying to infer that those responses can be broken down for the LGBTQ plus population, the margin of error will be so high that would be probably meaningless. So it depends on what you're trying to study, what the nature of that phenomena is, how much money, how much time, and what can you stand behind in terms of the quality that is there. So it's a simple question, how big? But the answer is exactly what Claire said. It depends.
I love that. Thank you. Let's go to the third one, the mode of kind of surveying people. So we've talked, there's at least face-to-face, there's telephone, there is, even within telephone, it's cell phone and landline. And then there's also, I guess, internet. Nick, which one do you use? Why?
We use them all. How's that? We're ecumenical. So, and maybe this is another thing. I always worry about any researcher that just says, I have one way to do the survey and it is a solution for everything. So we do telephone surveys, we do one-on-one personal interviews, we do online surveys, both probability and non-probability. But actually, one thing that I want to put on the table for discussion, and this is especially critical for anyone that's doing research in the government sphere, is using the right mode for the right audience. And let's talk about marginalized populations in Canada. And what we found in our research, at least, is that to reach marginalized populations, they don't all have access to the internet. If you have people that are underemployed, unemployed, might be homeless. I think we have to be very careful, because I think sometimes you're in a department and you have a budget to do a survey, and then you start going down this path, and then you get to the very end, and then someone says, hey, are we going to be able to include marginalized Canadians in this because it's important for a public policy issue? And then you find out you're doing like an opt-in online panel, which probably skews towards more affluent people who have a higher educational attainment. And then you realize maybe that's the wrong tool for this, and that you need a telephone survey. In the same way that if you were doing a population that had a high educational attainment, you'd probably go online. You could still have a probability survey. But I think one of the challenges is that if we gain these populations, if part of being the government of Canada is to help everybody, we have to make sure that we're administering the right mode for the right objective. And I find sometimes that's not discussed until the very end of the methodology discussion, as opposed to the beginning of the methodology discussion. And so I'm not here to cast aspersions on any mode, because I believe as researchers, we have to use everything. But you have to ask, what's important for this project? And is this the right mode for the target audience that we want to reach?
Claire, what do you think of that?
I think that I would open up to perhaps we are heading towards a situation where there's not one right mode. Yeah. Perhaps what we're seeing in the US right now is something like there are people who will never answer a telephone polls, and there are people who will never answer a web poll. And there are people who are never going to answer an IVR poll. And so combining gives you the possibility to reach out to a better variety of people. Of course, after that, the problem, and this is Anil will see it, is how you weight this together. So this is a problem. Concerning landline and cell phone, all the people who do telephone polls, whether IVR or with interviewer, put the two in their sample right now. The fun thing about it is in 2016 in the US, I was on the committee who looked at the polls, and we asked telephone pollster what was the proportion of cell phone in their samples. So it varied from 25% to 75%. And it's not a bell curve, it's a uniform, okay? There is absolutely no difference in estimate according to the proportion of cell phone in the sample. So that was in 2016. It may have changed, because there are more and more people who are cell only and all that. But I still see this disparity in, the question is, what is the proportion of cell only people that you can join only on cell? And I get answers like, yeah, this percent of the population. And then I ask, yes, what is the percentage of households? Oh, we calculate the proportion of person for cell phone and households for the other kind. I don't want to be a statistician to weight these polls afterwards.
Yeah. So I think that's in some ways, I think what you've all said is kind of the mode is a little bit, it comes back to the randomness, because as the population becomes less homogeneous in terms of how you reach them. In the past, you could reach everybody with a landline, or not everybody, but a good chunk of the population. Now you reach more people with cell phones, fewer people, et cetera. So it kind of a little bit comes back to randomness. I'm going to go in, it'll be a little philosophical now in terms of polling. And I want to kind of go into a little bit of the notion, like, do polls reflect what people feel, or do polls help kind of tell people what they're feeling? There's this notion that sometimes polls can be dangerous. And I know in the past we've had kind of things like, you know, we would ban the publication of polls close to an election, or even in France. In France, I think for a while, for a decade or two, they even banned polling entirely. So let's kind of start a little bit of that conversation of, do polls reflect, or do polls also do more than reflect? A little bit like Heisenberg, is it the act of observation impacts on what you're observing? Claire, you're very eager, which scares me, but start us off.
Yes, but it should not. This is something I researched. So, yeah, in France, it was 1 week before the election, I think 2 weeks perhaps, but you still have countries. There is a report on the WAPO website about, I think we have 130 countries of the world where there are bans and no bans and all that, and there you still have, I think Italy, it's 1 month, things like that. What happened in France in the last presidential election? Now they have only a 1-day ban. On that day, there was a poll published in Switzerland and another poll published in Belgium, saying, well, this is Fillon is ahead, you know, and it was not true. So you cannot ban, the first thing is you cannot ban poll anymore, because anybody can, if there is an election in Quebec, you can publish a poll in Ontario, in US, anywhere, okay? So you cannot ban poll. The second point is, it would be extremely dangerous and undemocratic, because polls would still be conducted. Who would have access to polls? Those who can pay for polls. So the population would not have access to its own opinion, but some people who can pay for it would have. The second point, very important, is that when polls are public, you can check. If they are not public, you replace polls by rumors.
Yeah.
And this is extremely dangerous.
Yeah. Nick, do you guys tell us what to think, or do you tell us what we're thinking?
We tell you what you're thinking. You know, on the, you know, what worries me is not a ban. And I'll tell you, if there was a ban, I'd be rich, because everyone, you know, to Claire's point, what is now in the public domain for the public good to put scrutiny on politicians would not exist, and people would be corporations, hedge funds would be paying money to get the information that would not be in the public domain. So I'm not worried about banning, because it's not feasible. But I'll tell you what I am worried about. I'm worried about the weaponization of polls. And I think that's what we saw in the last US presidential election, especially at the state level. I've read a number of the state polls, and I will tell you that I was mortified at the lack of detail and transparency at a lot of these state polls. They didn't say who paid for the poll. They didn't say all the questions that were asked on the poll. They didn't explain their modeling or weighting that they were doing. And then, to Claire's point, these things were just mashed together with other polls. And you know, I worry about, you know, and this is exacerbated in a social media environment where we're all in an echo chamber. And if someone likes a poll, they cite it, and the next day, if they see another poll that they don't like, that contradicts what they personally believe, they believe that that's not credible. So, you know, I'd say, you know, for the pollsters, you know, less rock star, more researcher, right? Just say the numbers and let people do their own interpretation and be transparent. And that's one thing I think Canada does a lot better job in the industry than the United States. For those major firms, they're much more transparent and they're much more consistent in their reporting compared to those 80 firms, large firms in the United States that are doing stuff.
So if there's a poll that says X percentage of Canadians are worried about losing their job, or Y percentage of Canadians are fearful of the future or hopeful about the future, doesn't that impact me? Doesn't that say to me, oh, you should be fearful because 80% of your fellow Canadians are fearful?
Well, I don't think as many people are watching polls as you might think, Tyche. More people are watching the news. And when we look at what's in the news, we find that the news actually drives behavior more than polls.
I think what is more dangerous is when government use polls in support for their policies, and there are some types of policies that are not a matter of public opinion. For example, when the government decided to stop the death penalty, it was in 1970. The first time we've seen in a poll a majority of the Canadian population against death penalty was 2002. If at that time the government had said, okay, people are for going on with death penalty, so we don't abolish death penalty, it would still be there. Everything, there are some policies that government have to sell to the population, and it's not a matter of public opinion. And this is a dangerous use of polls, I would say.
What a fascinating, yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add, if you're a policymaker and you're, looking for information, one option is, of course, you look at what exists in the public domain on a particular topic. I would say, look at the entire poll. What was the main thrust of that poll? What were other questions around it that were asked, so that you don't take something out of context? Look at the timing of what it was and what was popular, what was in the news, how were people's thoughts being shaped by what was going on outside. So do a little bit more digging than just take the answer to one question out of context. To know when a poll makes sense, if you're going to actually conduct a poll and you're going to pay for something, look at and ask the kinds of questions that you have. What is the transparency? Is the pollster giving you, what sample size, how they're picking it, what's the non-response rate? Many pollsters don't put that out there. By the way, you should be careful about that. And should be differentiating between when a poll makes sense and when a survey makes sense. And then when you do give advice, to Claire's point, caveat it. Just because a poll says something, that's not necessarily, where the country may want to go. And you have example after example of where the poll may say something, because everybody wants to belong to the prevailing thought in many cases. And that's not necessarily always in the best interest of a minority group or a different conversation. So, don't put too much emphasis. Know enough, inform yourself, ask the right questions, and it's about fit for purpose and using the right tool for the right job.
What a fascinating hour. Anil has done what I was going to ask each of you to do. So Anil, you've already gone, which is close us off with a word of wisdom to the public servants out there who are grappling with this. I love, Anil, that you introduced the notion of a survey versus a poll, use the right tool, be critical, be understanding. Claire, what's your closing wisdom to the public servants out there vis-a-vis this subject?
Do not do cherry picking of polls.
Do not do cherry picking. So don't go out.
Which means don't just go take the poll that fits what you think. You need to have a number of polls. And this is the theory of polls anyway. You need to have a number of polls. You need to look at what are the questions. So do not cherry pick. This one is okay for me, so I just keep it.
And Nick, what's your closing wisdom for us?
My closing wisdom of think of the population and what you're trying to achieve, and make sure that you're using the right mode, right way to do the survey for the right population and the right content.
Claire, Nick, Anil, thank you so much for being friends of the Public Service of Canada. Thank you for taking an hour to talk to us about a very, very important subject. And thank you for being illuminating and insightful and funny as we went along. So all my very best, and thank you for this hour. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.